to say, well, science explains the how questions, and religion attempts to explain the why questions. Even about our physical universe, we understand only 5 or 10%. We don't understand about most of what goes on, like dark matter and dark energy and so on. The noble savage is associated with Rousseau, the philosopher Rousseau, and it is a fiction. Also, the whole point of capitalism and advertising in our society is to make you miserable. Its economy is growing much faster. It's technologically now far ahead. And yet it doesn't have democracy. It overthrows one of the whole basis of Western economics. So in The Art of War, he said, the art of war is to win wars without fighting. If you are a general and you lose a single troop, you have lost the battle.
The Inspire Us podcast.
I'll leave you to argue with Leonardo about this. And you were asking, actually, what I said was that my friend, who was a very distinguished academic and at some time head of Hokkaido University, he came on after he read something when he said, Alan, I now understand myself. I am the shaman. So he was the shaman. Not me.
Okay. Awesome.
I'd like to be a shaman. Try.
So what is a shaman?
What is a shaman? Well, shaman is a religious practitioner or ritual practitioner who characteristically inherits his and sometimes her powers, often from their family. Usually they go through some kind of initiation. They're fairly ordinary, and then they go out and no one sees them for a few months, and then they come back from wherever they've been, which probably a forest or something. And then they have this power, which means that they can fly out of their bodies into parallel worlds, communicate with spirits, see the future, heal people. And they often do it with using sound, with drums. The most famous shamans are Siberian and so on. They have a one-sided drum, and they beat this and a certain drum rhythm. Some of them, but not all of them, go into a trance, and they sort of shake, and then they're in this trance. And when they're in this trance, they can see the other world. So people can say, what's happened to my father? And they can say, oh, your father's safe over there, or what was my mother? So they can speak rather like seances in Western Korean literature and so on. They can communicate between this world and another world. They often do sacrifice animals and use their blood. They often participate in funeral and other rituals. And they're particularly there to diagnose the cause of problem or some particular illness. So I'll give you a little story. When I was about 15, 20 years ago, I was closing the desk in my table in my home, and I accidentally got my finger stuck in it, and it broke, and it was very painful. And then shortly after that, I suddenly went deaf. Well, just on a particular day, particular time, I went deaf in one ear, completely deaf. So I went to the National Health Service and they said, well, it might be this, it might be that, but I didn't know. And I asked other people here, no one had any idea. So when I went to Nepal, I found the local shaman in the village. One of whom had become very close friends. His son was at my age and very close friend we spent a lot of time together. Anyway, one of the shamans said, if you give me a chicken, I'll cut off its head and tell you what's caused this. So they did that.
When he said that, did you believe him, or did you have doubt?
Well, the definition of poetry, which is, I think it is, the definition is a willing suspension of disbelief. And the key word there is suspension. So you neither believe nor not believe. And with many interesting things, we don't know it's true, we don't know it's not true. So I suspended disbelief. I certainly, with him, I gave him the money for the chicken, and he sacrificed it. He said, well, you've been bewitched. Oh, there are a number of witches in this religion. So supposedly the witch, I said, where? And he said, well, up there, they can't say her name because it's dangerous. You know what I mean? Some old lady living Macfarlane. Anyway, he said, I'll do this little ritual and it'll cure you, throw the witch away. So he did it. And I went home to England. And it didn't heal. He said, send me a postcard if it hasn't worked and I'll do another one. He forgot to mention out of politeness that he couldn't read and that there was no postal service to the village, so it wouldn't be much point. Anyway, I went back and said it didn't work. And then he said, well, I think the chicken you gave me was a bit small. Give me a bigger chicken. Anyway, that's shamanism. It's and you'll find it in American Indian societies. You'll find it in right across Central Asia. You'll find it in Nepal. Find it in China. After the great earthquake, the Sichuan earthquake, there's a film of these people with drums banging and dancing around, trying to quell the evil spirits that have been caused by the earthquake. Anthropologists think it's a more or less universal phenomenon in the period before writing and civilization and so on, in the oral period, that the humans were faced with sickness, with floods, with dangers. How we better communicate? You know there are spirits all around you. There are certain people who can act in that capacity.
Yeah, especially talking with Dara, I was really introduced, I'd say, to this aspect in West Africa. They call it juju, and it's like witchcraft, and I recognize it, but it was so foreign to me growing up in the West, and nothing I've ever heard before, and I really, to me, didn't believe in it. It's like, if I don't see it, it's not true. But now that talk to more people about it, it seems like it's universal and it's all over the world except here.
And there's such a better picture of it, and all over India, all over Africa, all over Southern America, even within Catholicism, there's a lot of these sorts of beliefs. In certain branches of Islam, but not others. That's why Salman Rushdie got into trouble because he mixed up and denigrated it. But almost all world religions, I don't think Judaism has these some beliefs in it, but certainly 90% of the world's population believe these things, and of course we did to a certain extent in the past. I wrote my doctoral thesis at Oxford as a historian was on 17th century English witchcraft. So I spent 4 years studying witches in England, wrote a book on witchcraft in that period. And I worked with the greatest expert in the world, who was the professor of anthropology at Oxford, Alan Macfarlane, and he worked on with African witchcraft on the Azande. It was what I asked him actually interesting, because he was a Catholic and available souls and typical upper middle class Englishman. And asked him, "Do you believe in witchcraft?" He looked at me and said, "Of course I do." But he also explained one of the central features of witchcraft, which is to do with the fact that when we are asked the causes of things, we ask two different questions. We ask, how did this happen? And we ask, which is a technological question, how did this car crash occur? How did I get cancer? Etc., etc. And the doctors and police can say, well, you did this and that. But there's another question there, which is the why question. Why me? Why no? And here, well, I gave a nice example of a missionary in Africa who met one of his converts, he was Christian, and the convert said, I've been bewitched. And his pastor said, why do you think that? And he said, well, I'm sweating and my temperature's going up and down and so on and so on. And the pastor said, well, we know that's malaria. And he said, yes, I think it's malaria. And we know what causes malaria. He said, yes, mosquitoes. But who sent the mosquito? And why me? So this is why, to a certain extent, many of the people I've interviewed were scientists. I'm always surprised, I used to be surprised, that they could also be devout Christians. They used to say, well, science explains the how questions, and religion attempts to explain the why questions. So they don't,
But not in conflict.
or conflict with each other.
I do love the topic of witchcraft. I almost feel not justified, but it's just being of a Nigerian origin. This is taken as fact. No one disputes these things. Absolutely everyone believes it, have witnessed it. It's a big part of our culture. But you come here and it's seen as crazy. But you know what? It's actually still here in small pockets. It's just very, it's on the fringe. My mate's grandmother, she still practices these things, and she goes out in nature and she has friends, and she's in a community where they have these rituals, and they're still connected to the old, what do you call it? The old religions, let's say. So it's still here, but it's just the attitude is extremely hostile to it.
Well, I have a feeling we talked about this last time. It's most people. Most people think of themselves as rational, and everyone else is irrational, and everything else particularly so. And there was, probably for good reason, a reaction against beliefs of witchcraft in this country. But if they've gone on, then we'll continue to have these unfair and ridiculous trials, and people being executed for something that they probably couldn't have committed. So, but most people actually, a lot of the time, believe in things equally irrational. It's just that they don't see it in themselves. So I think, well, surveys which they've done in religious and other kinds of beliefs. For example, American population, I think about 70% of them, vaguely remembering, believe in angels and spirits and so on and so on. So other people's beliefs are always crazy, just you explain.
Yeah. I guess, it's hard to distinguish between what's real and what's not, because you don't want people dying because they're accused of being witches. But that doesn't mean that there isn't any truth to paganism or to people having special abilities to connect to the elements. And it's about deciphering.
That's the difficult thing, because all the time, studying witchcraft, I could work on the assumption that there was no such thing. that it's a belief system which we now know through science could not have existed. And when they came to that conclusion in the 20th century and stopped the trials, it was based on the actual fact that there is no such thing as witchcraft. Now, having been to countries where there were living witches, having learnt that we don't understand anything much about our world. I mean, I think we discussed this before, but even about our physical universe, we understand only 5 or 10%. We don't understand about most of what goes on, like dark matter and dark energy and so on. And that's also true of the dimensions of our life. We think sitting here that what we see is what there is. But you just get your mobile phone out and you're aware that a lot of signals, a lot of things are going flying through the air. We've discovered electricity and so on. So why couldn't there be many, many other things? Why couldn't this room, as some physicists say, be filled with other universes, curled up with thousands of universes? Why can't there be another 8 dimensions on top of the 4 that we know about? So in 100 years, people will look back and do they realize that anyone who's lived on this planet is still around? It's just that they're on another dimension. So we live in probably in a world of many parallel universes and many multiple dimensions. And what we see here and now around us is just a tiny. We can even see it with our eyes. I mean, I can only see you because I can see certain things. Well, I can't see infrared and ultraviolet, but they exist and other machines could see them. Human beings are very limited. I can only hear certain frequencies, but there are many other frequencies that are going on around us. So that probably is the case for the power of all kinds and spirits of all kinds. And the Chinese, like many other cultures, have always assumed that's the case. This is not the only world.
Yeah.
You said you were first looking at witchcraft from the perspective of course, this doesn't exist. At what point did you have a switch where you said, okay, well, maybe this does exist?
So there's no actual point in time. Even when I was studying it in Nepal, and I was told there were a number of witches in the village, I still thought, well, from my English experience, these are people who have followed the usual pattern in witchcraft in England was similarities that you were caught in a web of social obligation for people, like older people or women or whatever, and you should do something to help them and be kind to them and so on and so on. This was the thesis of my book, which is that the older Catholic integrated community kind of world where you had to help poorer people and other villages and so on, becoming into a clash with the new, more selfish Protestant, look after yourself first, cut off the ties ideology. And the clash of these was, one effect of it was witchcraft, because when some old lady who you've known for 10 years, 20 years, she was coming old and she'd been your neighbour and so on, and she came in for the 10th time to ask if she could borrow, in other words, have some grain or something. You said, no, enough is enough, go away. As you do on the street when someone asks you to help them find a bed for the night, you feel a twinge of guilt. And witchcraft was a method for guilt projection, so that you didn't blame yourself. So it was their fault. And the psychological mechanism was that we see what we want to see with. And when this old lady came, you said no, you heard her sort of muttering to herself. And you saw her face anew, instead of the face of the neighbour, you saw the face of a witch. You saw, as they put it then, methinks she is a witch. You suddenly saw the anger in her face and the line changing. So we projected onto her. I mean, we do it all the time. If we are showing the photograph and we're told it's a mass rapist and murderer, we can immediately say it's a mass rapist and murderer. If we're told it's Mahatma Gandhi and so on, we see what we are told to believe. So we did that. She went away, my tree. Next day, your child was ill. Where was my child in? I turned that old lady away. So we do this, and it's perhaps not a very good analogy, but Trump is doing this with his economic style. Instead of realizing that the American economy is in dire straits and dire trouble because for 30, 40 years they've lived off other people lending them money, buying their stocks and shares and bonds, he's projecting this onto the other and saying it's the unfair behavior and evil underlying practices of the Chinese and everyone else who has secretly been stopping us progress. So he's projecting not exactly his guilt, but the fault onto the other person, which is a pretty widespread mechanism. And one does that with development aid. If the people who are trying to help development aid, it doesn't succeed. Instead of saying it was my faulty plans and the way I interfered in their systems and economy, you just then say it's their corruption and inefficiency and their fault. So it's just projection of fault and guilt between them all the time. But that was not the mechanism behind a lot of English witchcraft. So I think it's just increasing it over time, discovering that India, China, Japan are all worlds where they assume that there are these multiple dimensions and powers and so on. I suddenly realized that this has implications for the possibility that your wishes can affect other people. The idea that of someone's internal hate causing the ill becomes somewhat less improbable.
How did your experience in Nepal change you? Was that your first field work?
It was my first field work outside Britain, yes. It changed me. I can't remember if we talked about this before, but I'll say it again. Changed me in several ways. One is that it made me realize that people who come from a far less privileged background, who have almost nothing that I have in terms of wealth, education, experience of work, that has no relation whatsoever to those people, either their intelligence, their character, anyway. So you can go anywhere in the world and meet a person as I did in this village. My adopted sister, Neil Meyer, who was a woman, and me adopted as my sister, and we had these long conversations with her, and I filmed her. She'd never been further than the nearest town. She'd never been to school. She was just spent her life working in the fields and bringing up her children and so on. But she was much cleverer and deeper than many of my colleagues in Cambridge. She had a nature of intelligence and understanding which many people here didn't have. And I didn't feel any cat points, even though she was a woman, she was younger, she was much educated and so on. So I discovered what some people call the psychic unity of mankind. Psychic, it's not exactly psychological, but sort of, that we are behind whatever we look like and whatever our experiences. We're 99% similar. There's only a tiny difference between us, as far like us and animals, and it's very different. Same across cultures. And so some of my Western arrogance and assumptions were was hopefully brushed away a bit by that experiments. That's, I think, the main. I mean, there are other things like Christianity. I was an evangelical Christian, brought up as one. I had believed there was God, and he was up there, and all the rest of what Christianity means for Christian. And I went for the first time to a place where you said God, and they said, "What do you mean God?" Like China, there's no word for God, no, or religion. There are all the sorts of different religions, ancestor worship, Buddhism, spirits, witches, all bits and pieces, but no religion. And you don't need it. Or again, I was brought up in a world where morality and God are tied together. So if you do something wrong, God is angry and be punished, you'll go to hell. So I was brought up in a world where, for example, sex was just guilt-inducing. I went to British old male boarding schools. And if you thought about women, that was a sin. So we were told more or less. And obviously other temptations. So I was brought up thinking that sex was dirty, guilt-inducing, dangerous, whatever. Went to a culture with it. Didn't have such idea. I mean, sex is sex. It's just like eating. Nothing more or less. Nor do I moral about it. When you behave reasonably with a wife and within certain codes, but there's nothing to do with hell and damnation. And that was a huge shock. So it did what anthropologists should do, which is to make them question your deepest assumptions. You may come back and say they were right, but at least you've given them an airing and seen what they're made of.
Just from your time being so immersed and intertwined with rural communities, do you buy into the idea of a noble savage? Do you think man has become encumbered by, modern civilization and it's become too overbearing? Do you think there is some benefit in a more rudimentary lifestyle, or do you think that we should always advocate for more wealth, and because you don't want anyone to be poor or without, but do you generally buy into this idea?
The noble savage is associated with Rousseau, the philosopher Rousseau, and it is a fiction, because if you study what I did in anthropologist, you study many very simple societies. They're not noble in any more sense than we are noble. I mean, they kill each other, they eat each other, they violate each other's women's shoes or what. I mean, human beings are neither good or bad. They're binary, but they're noble or what we noble is false. We are, as Alan Smith pointed out, we are both selfish and social. We have two sides to our character. We are kind and loving and creative and good and so on. We're also the exact opposite. We have both these tendencies, and our life is a mixture of the two. So we haven't gone from, this was the deep mistake of Karl Marx. That's why Karl Marx, not Marx himself, who was an irascible, but like honorable gentleman, but his descendants have caused more deaths in the 20th century than anyone else. And that's because they believed in this myth of the noble savage, that if you get rid of civilization, return to the simplest, no property, no class, no nothing, then everyone would be fine. Well, if you try that with China or in Korea or Soviet Union, you end up with mass famines and miseries. But it's based on a false premise that allowed to get rid of, Rousseau's famous statement, man is born free. If you get rid of the shackles, everyone will predate on everyone else. But Hobbes is right. Man, the life of man is nasty, brutish, and short in the simplest societies, but it's controlled by social rules and so on. So we shouldn't return to a fictitious world that never existed and become prominent. On the other hand, you shouldn't go to the other extent. Elon Musk is a mess. And, it is a lich. I don't know, getting a little suit, but it is a lich. He's heavily on drugs. I mean, he's pretty miserable. And he's an extreme. I mean, there are many rich people who are not happy at all. There is obviously a happy mean. If you are destitute, if you're poor, if you're hungry, and so on, it's very likely that you'll be pretty unhappy. But once you've got to a threshold of enough, there is no point in going on. At that point, I've discovered in my own life, you simplify things. You keep life simple. My routine is very simple. I eat the same things more or less every day, except when I go out or whatever. I get pleasures out of very simple things like walks and music or my garden or whatever. If you identify things that are simple and give you pleasure and they cause pain to other people, and you keep your desires within the range of the means, then you will have happiness. As Charles Dickens put it, if your desires are beyond your means, you will be constantly unhappy. Unfortunately, that is the basis of capitalism. The whole point of capitalism and advertising in our society is to make you miserable. In other words, to make you dissatisfied, to tell you need this bigger car, this better detergent, this whatever. Otherwise, the consumer system doesn't collapse, but it becomes less powerful. So to instill dissatisfaction and a feeling that offended is how capitalism works, what can we call an inquisitive society. And once you realize this, that you don't need that bigger car, then you'll probably be more satisfied. And the Buddhists and others take it to a further extreme and try and get rid of everything and live just a simple life of contemplation. But that seems to me a little, because ultimately you can't live a simple life of contemplation unless a lot of other people are doing a lot of hard work to provide the very things you need. So I wouldn't take it to that extreme, but I think if you look at certain parts of our society here, and certainly if you look at America, they've taken it to ridiculous extents of greed, avarice, egotism, and inequality, which are very dangerous.
Yeah, there is a sense that it leads us to forever misery. This idea of, you think you're in a 1-bedroom, you want the 2-bedroom, and then when you have the 2-bedroom, and I only have a small TV, maybe let me get a bigger TV. I only have maybe a Toyota, I have to have the Range Rover, and then you want the helicopter. There's always something, and you realize it's not the something, but it's something inside that you're feeding.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, yeah, this capitalism does feed that. So maybe capitalism does feed this whole society of everyone being miserable. And on that, you briefly mentioned Trump, and he is kind of like this image of capitalism, but he is also this image of this growing anti-China sentiment that is happening in the West, where a lot of people are feeling fear with China. They think an opposing military, they think an opposing economy. And I wonder, what would you think about this growing sentiment, China, and is it something that the West doesn't understand? And how do you feel about this clash going on between the two societies?
Did we talk about this before?
Maybe perhaps last session.
Perhaps we did.
I'm feeling we did. I always have to try again. Well, if we did, I'd probably alluded to a book by Graham Allison from Clash of called, not the Clash of Civilizations, that's my book. Called The Thucydides Trap. And I could like that. Remember the Thucydides Trap? Allison's argument from looking at previous examples was that whenever a great power is challenged by an up-and-coming power, like when Sparta was challenged by Athens or whatever, the French by the British or the Germans by the English by the Germans, then in most cases you'll get a clash and a fight to maintain. It's like sort of you see in nature films when you see a dominant male deer being challenged by it and so on. And so this is that sort of clash. And what you're trying to do if you're the dominant power is to discredit the up-and-coming power and say it's cheating and it's infringing human rights and so on and so on and so on. So there's a huge pressure in America to do that. And that's part of it. There's another, which is this, I think, more interesting, which is this existential threat that China poses, which most people don't kind of analyze and know about. One of them is to Christianity, to evangelical Christians, particularly, which is that it was assumed that Christianity is right, every other faith system, and it can't really be either successful or really civilized unless you're a Christian, preferably a Protestant or a Catholic or whatever. Now, China doesn't have a religion. It's bad enough with the Muslims, or the Jews. They do have a God and they have a religion, even if it's different from us. These guys, they don't even know what the God is. I mean, they no religion, and yet they seem to be doing rather well. Does that mean God is not on our side, as we thought? God is going to make us victorious or lead us, and so on. So it's a real threat on that level. The second is democracy. It was believed until very recently in art and economics and others that planned and centralized states were less efficient economically than democratic systems. And that's why we defeated the Soviet Union. That's why the West won and our empire spread across the globe, because we were a better political system, more moral, because it was, the people were in charge, and more efficient because you responded to the people and so on. And that was all very well until the year 2000. Then you get a country which is a different kind of democracy. It has democracy, but it's not our elective party democracy. And it is beating us. Its economy is growing much faster. It's technologically now far ahead. It lives within its means. It's peaceful, non-violent. It's not large crime. It's egalitarian. The approval rate by the people is about 80 to 90% in its governmental system. It goes to 35%. And yet it doesn't have democracy. It overthrows one of the whole bases of Western economics. And so on. So China is not just doing better and rising and maybe equaling us militarily, but it is a different way of solving life's problems, which have its merits. Now, in terms of the military, one thing to perhaps, if I didn't say it before, is that the whole obsession, what we do, we in the West have been fighting each other, non-stop battles in nation states in Europe for the last 1,000 years. We just fight. And so we think that the way you gain power or prevent yourself from, as I mean, it's encapsulated in a favourite statement that's going around the rounds of the Poles. The Polish are very hostile to the Russians. And one of the things they say is, you're always going to have an army in your country. The question is whether it's your own army or someone else's army. So this is the attitude, if it's not our army, it'll be their army. And we, therefore, through that endless warfare of nations and then endless predatory empires conquering the world, we assume that we are like this, that everyone's like this. And when another nation, as in the past, or empire comes along, they will behave to us as we behave to them. We kicked China for 100 years, opium wars and Japanese invasion. We just were absolutely monstrous to the Chinese for a century. What will they do when they become top dog? If we were there, we'd come and kick us. They will invade us or take over the ocean to behave as we behave. It's complete rubbish. They wouldn't, because that isn't how China has worked for the last 1,000 years. If you take, for example, the last 60 years, the difference can be seen. In the last 60 years, America has killed, 70 years, they've killed tens of millions of people in constant wars, starting in Southeast Asia, South America, Africa, the Middle East, war after war after war. America is, it appears, completely happy until it is devastating. Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, wherever. And now a proxy war against Russia and proxy war against Gaza. Proxy wars are real wars are what Americans and the West do, and British are part of all this. If you look at the last 70 years of China, it's a huge country. It could, with its vast armies, have invaded and taken all the neighboring countries, South Korea, Vietnam, Burma, so on. In the last 70 years, China has been at war for 29 days. The 29 days were against Vietnam, when in 1978, Deng Xiaoping saw that Vietnam was getting very close to Soviet Russia. And Soviet Russia was along the border of China, and they were constantly in high tension. China was a friend of Cambodia, and Vietnam was going to invade Cambodia. So Deng said, if you threaten to invade, we will attack. We won't go in for more than the period we went into India when we invaded, which is 33 days. We will just show you that we could. So when they went into Cambodia, Deng sent troops in. They took all the northern cities along the border. And then they pulled out of it. They said, this is what we could do. That's all they've done. And in the last 1,000 years, the Mongols, but not the Han, tried to invade Japan twice. They went into Korea once. They invaded once or twice and then withdrew from Burma. But that's it. And they went for hundreds of years without any wars against anyone. So we just are a warlike. I mean, it's summarized in the great philosophers of war. We have as our great mentor, Clausewitz in Germany, who said that peace is war by other means, that you defend yourself by arming. You do what Europe is doing now, which is completely crazy. You're raising your defense expenditure to 3%, 4%, 5%, as if this is defense. I mean, what do other people think if you do that? Absolutely insane. But that's what Clausewitz said. Get your punch in first. Get ready to fight. Fight, fight, fight. The great philosopher of war in China, like everyone else 2,500 years ago. Sun Tzu, in The Art of War, he said, the art of war is to win wars without fighting. If you are a general and you lose a single troop, you have lost the battle, even if you formally won it. What you do is you put the other side into a position where they can't do anything but surrender. It's the difference between our major form for board game, chess, where in our chess system, you go in and you take the other pieces, you kill them, you knock them off the board. In Go, the great Chinese game, you surround the spaces. And when you've surrounded a space, that's yours. So what the Chinese will do, they hope, is to make the world peaceful, because they will treat the world as they treated their relations, which is called the galactic system of power. And that is that you imagine China, which was the great nation, the Middle Kingdom, round it, like the sun, circulated the planets, Vietnam, North Korea, Taiwan, Tibet, Burma. And the planets mustn't be sucked into the sun because then they're burned. But they mustn't go off because then they ally with someone else. So you have a tributary system where the Vietnamese and Koreans and everywhere, every year they sent people with gifts to the emperor and said, my lord, here are some gifts. And the emperor said, thank you. We will protect you. We will not allow anyone else to. So they had a tributary, flexible system. Now that, I think, is probably what may occur. In other words, Britain will not be filled with Chinese troops or anything like that, but we will be expected to be respectful, not to kowtow and kneel, but to appreciate that China is a great civilization and we can learn something from it. That there'll be a few more Chinese restaurants in Cambridge. There are already many Chinese visitors to Cambridge. But,
Well, also Chinese restaurants there. We walked by quite a few.
well, Cambridge is becoming Chinese, and all the better for it, because it's fine. That'll be a peaceful world, because they're not interested in the Belt and Road Initiative is all part of this. It's giving connections, respect, and equality to other countries. And so the first time we've had a chance since the failure of the League of Nations, the failure of the United Nations to have world peace will be because of an alternative model of politics, which is not warlike and confrontational, but is win-win, cooperative, golden harmony, which is all in Confucian thought and so on. And that's trade is good for people because it's win-win. Cooperation is good for us. We share, you share. We all benefit from it. So the Chinese are Adam Smiths. We have forgotten Adam Smith. Smith said trade is mutually beneficial. The Chinese believe that, and they believe that politics is mutually beneficial. We don't. We've forgotten, and we think that it's a war of all against all, which is ridiculous and will blow us all up. So the sooner we get over this, the range state women, the better.
And it sounds. What are we on time? Are we?
Well, we are able to stop fairly soon. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe we can stop on this. We wanted to ask you, Alan, with your depth of experience, both in the world and also similarly in what we're doing with all the interviews that you've done. But, I think wherever we're going to be or do in life, we want to be global citizens. Do you have any advice for us?
Well, being a global citizen in the sense of being interested in and sympathetic and empathetic to other cultures and other societies is the only way you can be now. But most people are, certainly of your generation. My generation, of course, and Trump's generation, we weren't brought up as global citizens. We were very nationally based and so on. But the extraordinary development of particularly the internet and international travel and education means that everyone is a global citizen. And what one hopes is that one becomes, as it were, colorblind. What I learned in Nepal and as a child in India, that you don't look at people's color, their gender, their background. You look at them as human beings. And you see in other parts of the world, they are just suffering and intelligent and interesting and curious human beings. And that means you have to be vigilant, because we started the previous question saying that we were being told and taught, the Chinese are dangerous, and go there. Most of the people who slag off China have never been there. Almost anyone who goes to China and spends time, and it's now getting easy, will find that the Chinese are the nicest, most courteous, gentle, pleasant, interesting, curious people in the world. That it's a wonderful civilization they've created in the last couple of generations, lifting 800 million people out of poverty during that process. And if you go to a place, it becomes much more difficult to hate it. But remember that the media, what you're presented with by our media, BBC and so on here, or American channels or whatever, is heavily in the pay of the government. And as they've noticed even here recently, the whole tone of the BBC has changed towards China in the last year or so, since Salman got in. Because before, the far right within the Conservative Party were very hostile and anti-Chinese, and the BBC knew that in order not to have their masters questioning what they were doing, they had to slant it against China. It's got better, still unbalanced. But the main thing for a global system is to be very wary of the media and how it portrays other countries, because very often, and so I would advocate anyone, for example, to not to watch so much mainstream television, but to watch Al Jazeera, which my wife and I watch, which is a much more balanced Qatar channel of television, to read the Global Times, which is online, read newspapers from other countries and see them, and get to know the country from the inside, not just from the outside. Okay?
Wow. Amazing. Thank you ever so much, Alan.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I should say thank you very much for your interesting and sympathetic questions. Okay?
Great.
Thank you.
Cheers.